Hey everybody, welcome to episode 9 of The Bitter Pill, a show where we offer up bitter pills of truth that many people find difficult to swallow, and that the corporate media doesn't even want you to know exist. So we're in the middle of a series comparing Democratic presidential candidates Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, and today what I want to do is take a close look at the environmental policy of these two candidates. So, spoiler alert here. I think they both should probably talk a bit more about environmental issues on the campaign trail than they do. But they do both have outstanding records for the most part and policy positions on the environment, better than any of the other candidates in the race. And there are differences between them, however, that are worth talking about. And it's also worth talking about whether their policy proposals go far enough. So, as you've probably heard, climate change is a pretty big deal. In fact, a recent report from Australia's Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration that I've got up here on the screen predicts that unless drastic action, I've got a summary of it here on the screen, I should say, unless drastic action is taken in the very near future to slow down climate change, we're going to have a combination of shortages of fresh water, food production instability, and extreme weather getting worse and worse over time, so that possibly by the year 2050 or so, there could be an existential threat to human civilization, and humans will be kind of hanging on to survival by their fingernails if they indeed have made it that far. Now, they don't give any. Uh, they say really it's difficult or impossible to estimate how likely such a scenario is, but they say the evidence suggests that it is indeed a possibility. And they point out that it would be a really terrible idea to underestimate or dismiss the possibility of such a dire outcome occurring. And as I suggest, unfortunately, most predictions about the scope and pace of climate change that have occurred over time have underestimated how rapidly it's happening up to this point. So that needs to change. And fortunately, there have been other reports over the last couple of years, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at them, that have predicted more severe outcomes if we don't do something really, really drastic. And there are all sorts of other dire environmental problems out there. Freshwater supplies are being rapidly depleted and polluted. Samples of drinking water from Flint, Michigan, as pointed out by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, found that 13,000 parts per billion of lead were in the community's drinking water, which is nearly 900 times higher than the EPA's maximum limit of 15 parts per billion. And scientific evidence shows that this lead contamination has killed at least a dozen people in Flint from Legionnaire's disease. And it's overall caused deterioration in the short-term and long-term health of tens of thousands of people in the Flint, Michigan area, with unknown future consequences in terms of rates of cancer and other serious health issues. And water supplies are likewise dangerously contaminated in scores of communities all around the country by all sorts of sources: lead, mercury, PCBs, agricultural runoff, fracking, mining, oil spills, and you can just go on and on. Um, Rates of asthma are a big problem. And air pollution both can cause asthma and make it worse. It can make asthma symptoms worse and trigger asthma attacks. And exposure to coarse particulate matter was found in one study to be linked to the likelihood of developing asthma as well as the likelihood of asthma attacks. There's other research that suggests that air pollution can cause genetic damage that increases the rate of asthma. And the list of environmental problems goes on. A third of the planet's land mass is now desert. Hundreds of thousands of acres of rainforest, one estimate I saw said about 200,000, are cleared or burned down every single day. And more than 20% of the Amazon rainforest is now gone. We're in the midst of the largest mass extinction of animals in 65 million years. One estimate I saw said that over a third of all animal species currently are in danger of extinction. Our oceans are in big trouble. We've lost half of our coral reefs just in the last 30 years. And overall, due to a combination of overfishing, agricultural runoff, oil spills, dumping of plastics and other trash, and pollution by all sorts of different toxic chemicals, the effects have been quite deadly. So we've lost half of the coral reefs, as I said. Could lose them all eventually. And estimates have been made that at the current rate of depletion of populations of fish, every single species of fish currently consumed by humans will be extinct within the next 30 years, less than 30 years by this point. It's widely acknowledged that our fossil fuel economy is a primary cause of most of these problems. Particularly, you hear about the contribution of fossil fuel burning and extraction and other uses to climate change. It's also associated with all sorts of other environmental problems. One thing that's not nearly as widely acknowledged as a major contributor to environmental problems, including climate change, it's the second leading contributor to climate change is animal agriculture. So you've got cows emitting methane, you've got forests being cleared to make way for cattle ranching and for growing of crops to feed livestock. And the list goes on. I'll address it in more detail some other time. But really neither of these industries are ecologically sustainable, at least at anything remotely approaching their current levels. The Earth cannot handle either fossil fuel use or animal agriculture at anything like its current level. And really, we don't need to burn fossil fuels, and we really need to stop as soon as we can. So let's talk now about the two candidates. Tulsi Gabbard grew up in the beautiful state of Hawaii, probably the most culturally and ethnically diverse state in the United States. Majority population of people of color. Tulsi herself is part Samoan. And perhaps due to its natural beauty and the opportunities that people have had to enjoy the outdoors in a warm place like Hawaii, it's a very environmentally conscious place. But Tulsi says that another thing that contributes to environmental consciousness in Hawaii is the Hawaiian philosophy of aloha. Now, you often hear aloha used as a greeting in Hawaii, But as she points out, it's more than just that. It's a way of life. Aloha means I come to you with an open heart, with love, respect, and acknowledgement that we are all brothers and sisters and that all life is interconnected. Um, and part of that connectedness, she goes on to say, concerns the natural environment. So for her, interconnectedness includes a promise to protect all living things, the earth that we inhabit, the air that we all breathe, and the water that gives us all life. So, when she was growing up, her parents instilled in her the value that serving other people, helping other people out was important to the duties of human beings. So the family would go on service days, so to speak, where they would pick up litter off of the beach or prepare food for homeless families. And at first, she resented having to take time away from surfing, which she very much enjoyed. But ultimately, she discovered that she was happiest when she was serving other people. And shortly after that, as a young teenager, her career as an environmental activist began. She was co-founder of a group called the Healthy Hawaii Coalition, and they developed a program where they went into elementary schools and taught kids about the importance of protecting land and water resources. And ultimately, she decided that she could have more impact as if she went into politics. So she uh, became the youngest state legislator in Hawaii's history at the age of 21. Um, but within a short time after that, the attacks on 9/11 happened, and eventually she decided that the way she wanted to serve others was by enlisting in the National Guard, Army National Guard, and um, serving uh, the nation in that capacity. Um, and she discovered after she got there that the Iraq War was not what it was cracked up to be. It was that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We were lied to about that. And she just learned a lot about um, the difficulties that people had when they had governments that restricted their civil liberties. So she changed her views on a lot of things, including, for example, um, gay rights. But in any case, she came back from her deployment and as a medic in a National Guard unit, and went back into politics. And eventually, she decided to run for Congress. She was elected and began serving in January of 2013. And she's been a leader on many environmental issues while in Congress. I mentioned earlier that she visited Flint, Michigan, um, and has been an outspoken critic of the government's lack of action in cleaning up the water there and in many other cities. You may have seen the infamous incident where Barack Obama visited Flint, Michigan, and pretended to drink from a glass of the local water and pronounced it fine. And um, some, but not nearly enough, has been done to try and clean up things at Flint, and people are still suffering from the effects of contaminated water there, as they are in dozens of communities across the country. So a number of bills have been introduced into Congress that would set aside uh, quite a bit of money to improve drinking water and wastewater services, renovating uh, old pipes and uh, cleaning up supply of water to communities like Flint. Tulsi's also been a strong supporter of sustainable agriculture, um, food self-sufficiency, backing legislation to promote urban gardens, also backing legislation to fight against invasive species, to legalize industrial hemp, and to label genetically modified foods. And she doesn't talk about it very much, but she also happens to be the only vegan in the presidential race at this time, now that Cory Booker has dropped out. Um, and you might wonder why I bring that up. Well, as I mentioned earlier, animal agriculture is extremely ecologically destructive, and she has talked about that at times on the campaign trail. But what she's known for the most in terms of environmental policy, although not nearly as well known, of course, as her opposition to wars, is that she's the only member of Congress who has introduced a climate change bill, the Off Fossil Fuels Act. The OFF Act, as it's called for short, calls for the U.S. to transition away from fossil fuels to 100% clean energy by 2035 and 80% by 2027. You notice when this article is published, September of 2017. So Tulsi was way out front on legislation to combat climate change. This was a couple of years before, almost 2 years before the Green New Deal resolution introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and almost exactly 2 years before Bernie came out with a plan on climate change. So anyway, getting back to the details of the bill. So 80% off of fossil fuels by 2027, 100% by 2035. And this applies to both home and industrial energy use and to transportation. And the bill also expresses strong support for the principles of environmental justice adopted at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. It calls for a ban on the targeting of poor communities by polluters. It calls for an end to the fossil fuel industry, subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and it bans fracking, nuclear power, and oil and natural gas exports. The bill also calls for providing jobs at a living wage for any worker displaced from their jobs as a result of the transition. And overall, Tulsi has excellent ratings on her environmental voting record from groups that rate legislators on such things, ranging from somewhere in the 90s to 100%, depending on the year. And Bernie Sanders has similarly had very high ratings on his environmental legislative record from environmental groups. So let's talk about Bernie a bit. I will. There's Tulsi's bill, the Off Fossil Fuels Act, which I will put a link to, as I will put links to some of these other things I've been scrolling through here in the description of the video. So let's look at Bernie's Green New Deal plan. His plan calls for a complete transition to renewable energy. I had stuff underlined here, but anyway. A complete transition to renewable energy by 2030 for electricity and transportation, with an overall carbon emissions reduction target of 71% by that year, and decarbonization of all other sectors of the economy, such as, for instance, plastic manufacturing, by 2050. So Bernie points out that despite the fact that this is an enormous public investment, he estimates $16 trillion, it's not out of line with the kinds of mobilization of uh, federal financial resources that were made during the New Deal or World War II. Um, but this time, we're doing it to save the planet, and we're going to try to make sure that people of color and other minority communities are you know, that their needs are taken care of in this legislation. So as he points out, you know, prior to the original New Deal, hardly anybody had electricity, and one of the achievements of the New Deal was that it massively invested in rural electrification, and almost everyone had electricity as a result. Um, so, if we can do that, or if we can put a man on the moon, we can certainly transform our energy system away from fossil fuels to 100% renewables and create many jobs in the process. Um, so, like Congresswoman Gabbard, Senator Sanders' proposal calls for providing jobs at a living wage for any workers displaced from their jobs as a result of the transition. And in fact, actually, Bernie goes a bit further than Tulsi on the employment front and includes in his proposal a plan to create 20 million new jobs in sectors needed to address the climate crisis, such as building and installing solar panels and so forth. Um, and so, he really wants to use the Green New Deal as a tool for ending unemployment as well as increasing wages. So he goes a bit further. He's using the Green New Deal to do more than just combat climate change. Although Tulsi's bill certainly does ensure that any workers displaced from jobs in the fossil fuel industry have available to them other jobs that pay them well, uh, mostly in the renewable energy sector. Another similarity between Bernie's plan and Tulsi's bill is that he also calls for a ban on the targeting of poor communities by polluters. He also calls for an end to fossil fuel industry subsidies, as well as a ban on fracking and rapid phase out of nuclear power, which, by the way, uh, AOC's and Ed Markey's Green New Deal resolution does not include a ban on fracking or on uh, nuclear power at the present time. But Bernie calls for all of these things: rapid phase out of nuclear power, banning fracking, and um, fossil fuel industry subsidies. He also, like Tulsi, makes a point of discussing the need to redress environmental racism. I should note, though, that speaking of environmental racism, Bernie in the late 1990s pushed a plan to dump Vermont's nuclear waste in the poor Hispanic community of Sierra Blanca in southwestern Texas, which didn't pass, fortunately, for those people. But as you might imagine, he got a lot of heat for it. It was an issue that was brought up in the 2016 presidential campaign. So he doesn't have an unblemished record on environmental issues. Nor does Tulsi, but I don't think she tried to do anything like that. But in any case, continuing with the discussion of Bernie's plan, like Tulsi, he includes specific proposals for improving the ecological sustainability of agriculture. And like Tulsi, Bernie emphasizes in discussing his Green New Deal plan the need for international cooperation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and generally encouraging ecologically sustainable practices. So we can't very well help in the effort to promote a transition away from fossil fuels beyond our own borders if we don't have good relations with other countries. Now, I would have to ask Bernie, well, given that you recognize that, why are you pushing Russiagate? Why are you, attacking the Russian government, promoting, sort of hostile, paranoid notions about the government of Russia that don't have any basis in fact? Okay, well that's, I won't go into detail on that because that's an issue for another video. So, how did these two candidates stack up overall on environmental issues? I'd say overall they're both much better on the environment than any of the other Democratic candidates. An advantage for Bernie is that he has more specifics on some matters in his plan. It's about twice as long as Tulsi's bill. So, for example, he specifies a particular number of jobs he wants to create, and also his plan explicitly expresses an intention of using climate change legislation as a tool for ending unemployment and creating jobs at a living wage in the environmental sector or renewable energy sector. But I do think that Tulsi deserves a lot of credit for being out front on the issue, putting forth a bill, the only bill to date, over 2.5 years ago, or about 2.5 years ago in Congress. Whereas AOC's resolution, the Green Deal resolution, is just a resolution at this point, not a bill. And Bernie only recently, in September of last year, came out with his detailed climate change proposal. Tulsi is also the only person who was a member of Congress at the time who went to Standing Rock, North Dakota, to protest. There's a picture of her at Standing Rock. She went there as a part of a contingent of veterans to protest against the pipeline that was being built through that community in North Dakota. I'll put a link to this article in the description of the video. But anyway, so she's been a very outspoken critic of that pipeline, as she has, of course, of the entire fossil fuel industry, obviously. But so she's been a leader on all sorts of environmental issues: Standing Rock, the Red Hill fuel dump in Hawaii, coral reefs, the potential contamination or actual contamination of water in communities other than Standing Rock, such as Flint, Michigan. Tulsi's also the only vegan in the presidential race, and to me that's significant because and I've observed both of these candidates pretty closely. I've been to a number of Bernie's campaign events and have watched several of Tulsi's online, and she just seems more cognizant than Bernie of the environmental damage that's being done by animal agriculture specifically. So I wanted to show a little clip here of when she was asked about animal rights, actually, at a campaign event back last summer.
Let's listen.
Hi, Tulsi.
Aloha.
I'm wondering, as president, how you would lead a fight for greater animal rights.
Great question. Throughout my time in Congress, this has been a very important issue for me, and have supported every piece of legislation to protect animals and to stop the senseless slaughter that we are seeing in many different ways, including something that we've seen in the VA and through the Armed Services Committee of how unnecessarily medical professionals are still using animals for training, when we see many other advanced countries in the world have stopped that practice and using science and technology to be able to get the kind of training that they need. I've been a lifelong vegetarian and been vegan now for a lot of reasons, but when we look at how unethically animals are treated in these factory farms across the country, it breaks my heart. And it's something that more people are starting to learn and recognize are having a damaging impact on our lives, on the air we breathe, on the water that we drink, and on our planet. So there's a lot that we can all do to see food as medicine and to improve our own health and well-being, but also look at how the choices that we make in our own lives impact those around us and impact our planet. So I'll continue that.
Okay, so I thought that was a very good statement there on the unnecessary harm that's being done to animals and our own health and the planet by our society's addiction to mass production of meat and other practices involving the exploitation of animals. And I'll certainly address that topic in detail since I'm a vegan myself in a future video, but that's not the topic for this time. The point I wanted to make here is that Tulsi is very aware of the devastating ecological impact of having animals being raised for meat or for milk production of milk or eggs and so forth on such a utterly massive scale where, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more livestock on the planet than there are wild animals. Bernie, on the other hand, hasn't recognized this so much. He's talked about some of the ecological impacts of factory farms, as he puts it, but he's been a major supporter of the dairy industry, which is really big in Vermont. And Ben and Jerry, the famous Ben and Jerry, I forget their last names, of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, are big supporters and donors of Bernie's and have served as campaign surrogates and even named a flavor of ice cream after him. So he's been a big supporter of the dairy industry and of animal agribusiness generally. So, in fact, a couple of animal rights activists, Jay Schuster and Zach Groff, wrote an article where the title was a question: is Bernie Sanders an animal agribusiness stooge? So they suggest that despite Bernie's opposition to the damage caused by the fossil fuel industry and various other corporate entities or industries, he doesn't exhibit the same anti-corporate policies when it comes to agribusiness. And animal rights activists have brought up those issues with him, as well as issues about animal agriculture and the environment, and to a significant extent, he and his campaign have been kind of dismissive about those issues. And Bernie supported subsidies to the dairy industry in Congress. He supported pretty much all of the animal agriculture bills that have provided massive subsidies to animal agriculture in general. as Groff and Schuster point out. It's one of the most conspicuous examples of corporate welfare. Also, Bernie raised no objection as a congressperson when Congress passed the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, a 2006 law that broadly criminalizes activism conducted supposedly for the purpose of damaging or interfering with the operations of an animal enterprise. Not only can you be labeled and charged as a terrorist if, for example, you break into a mink farm and free those animals, but even if you, for example, rescued animals that were being abused in a way that violated federal and state laws, you could be charged as a terrorist as a result of that, as has actually happened to animal rights activists in Utah. Um, Basically, the position that Bernie has taken is to criticize factory farming, as he puts it, holding what he calls factory farming as a boogeyman, um, while lauding family farms, so to speak, as the right way to do things. And as Groff and Schuster point out, that's exactly what corporations in the animal food business, like Chipotle or Whole Foods or Purdue Farms and so forth, that's exactly what they say. Let's have quote unquote humane, environmentally friendly family farms, but factory farms are bad, even though in fact, family farms are factory farms. The average American farm raising chickens has over 400,000 birds, and I won't get into treatment of the animals on these farms here. Suffice it to say, it's not good, regardless of whether the farm's labeled a factory farm or not. But in any case, my point here is that the environmental impact is very negative, regardless of the size of farms. Obviously, it matters in the case of an individual farm, but collectively, it doesn't make any difference whether you have 100 farms with 30 head of cattle or one farm with 3,000 cattle. They're still pumping out the same amount of methane, the same amount of waste, consuming the same amount of water, and so forth and so on. So Bernie says here, factory farms are responsible for 1.4 trillion pounds of animal waste in America. They are a threat to the water we drink and the air we breathe. And it is unbelievable to me that Republicans in Congress have been working overtime to exempt factory farms from environmental laws. Now, okay, I guess Bernie deserves some credit for speaking out against the air and water pollution emanating from factory farms, but this figure is for all farms, regardless of whether we call them factory farms or not. They're all a threat to the water we drink and the air we breathe, and they all contribute to all sorts of other environmental problems besides that. And folks have tried to, including myself, have tried to bring up with Bernie Sanders' campaign the environmental threat that's posed by animal agriculture, and really haven't gotten much of a response. He certainly has not acknowledged thus far its contribution to climate change. So really what's environmentally problematic is not that we have factory farms as opposed to family farms, but that just a huge number of, a far larger number of animals are being raised to be eaten by humans or to produce milk by humans and so forth than is ecologically sustainable. That's the real problem, and Bernie doesn't seem to get that. Tulsi does. Bernie mentioned in a tweet last summer when the forest fires in the Amazon were receiving a lot of media attention. And he said, climate change is a global emergency. Bolsonaro and his corporate cronies are burning the Amazon rainforest for personal profit and jeopardizing our planet's survival. My Green New Deal will impose climate sanctions against corporations that threaten our global climate goals. Now, okay, so he acknowledges that um, destroying the Amazon and other rainforests is a serious problem, but a couple of things wrong here. One is that this didn't start with Bolsonaro, who was only elected president of Brazil, I think, in late 2018. Destruction of the Amazon rainforest has been going on for a very long time before that. And the other thing that he just elides here, doesn't mention, is that it's specifically cattle ranching and growing of crops to feed cattle and other livestock that's the main driver of this. It's estimated that animal agriculture is responsible for up to 91% of destruction of the Amazon rainforest, either through clearing the forest for cattle to graze or for growing crops to feed to cattle and other livestock. Um, and the figure isn't quite that high in other parts of the world, but nonetheless, animal agriculture is responsible for a lot of the rainforest destruction in other parts of the world, particularly Central America. Um, and Bernie needs to acknowledge that. So I do see a big difference between Tulsi and Bernie in terms of their acknowledgement of the environmental impact of this particular uh, industry and the need to do something about that in terms of reducing our consumption of animal products and taking measures to uh, stop destroying the rainforest and other things. Um, At the same time, I would also say to Tulsi that she needs to talk about this issue more. The one clip that I just showed you is the only example I've come across of her um, addressing animal agriculture in her public appearances. And I'm sure there's something somewhere else, but it just hasn't been prominently featured. Um, so both Bernie and Tulsi need to be talking about this issue more, um, and they could stand to talk about environmental policy in general a bit more. Nonetheless, they do have the strongest records and stances on environmental issues of any presidential candidates in the race. I would give an edge to Tulsi on environmental policy, but Bernie is also very strong on environmental issues. So that's my assessment of Tulsi versus Bernie on the environment. So that's about all I have for today. Please let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like what you've heard, please consider liking and subscribing and chipping in a few bucks on Patreon. So in the next video, or maybe the next two videos, I'm going to compare Bernie and Tulsi on foreign policy and a few other issues, and just give an overall assessment of the two candidates. You may have seen me wearing my Unusual Americans for Tulsi shirt in the past, so as you might guess, I do support Tulsi Gabbard in the Democratic primary, but I do also think that Bernie is an excellent candidate compared to those that we usually have anyway. But in any case, next time I will talk about these two candidates' stands on some other issues. See you then.